It's time to update this video because there are new games and there are new prices thanks to the Rampocalypse. Nearly 2 years ago, I looked at is it worth $250 more to get a 5070 Ti over the 5070. Short version of that video was the 5070 Ti averaged 24% faster, but there were certainly some blowout wins where it was twice as fast thanks to its 16 gigabytes of VRAM versus 12 on the 5070, but it really just depends on the game and the settings that you're using. Now, in current pricing, the lowest price 5070 Ti that's in stock is $920, although the vast majority of them are closer to $1,000, and it's meant to have a $750 MSRP, so the Rampocalypse is hurting the 16 gigabyte card more than it's hitting the 12 gigabyte card, which is over its $550 MSRP, but you can find it as low as about $620, and then they do go up from there. So in current market prices, at least in the US, it's $320 more to get the lowest priced version of each card, and that represents a 53% price increase over the 5070 to get the 5070 Ti. Now, the models I'm looking at in this video are the Founders Edition 5070 and the Asus Prime 5070 Ti. Both were received as review samples, and test system specs are in the video description. Now, some of you are screaming at your screen, what about AMD? Well, the 9070 can be had for about $620, $610, has 16 gigabytes of VRAM, and I've already looked at the 5070 against the 9070 recently in a separate head-to-head video with my full thoughts on that. Summary is 9070 is about 16% faster in the latest games, but there are some differences depending on the settings that you use, feature set differences, so watch that video for my full thoughts on that. Same thing for if you want my full thoughts on 9070 XT versus 5070 Ti, where the 9070 XT version can be had for around $690 right now, representing a lot better value than the 5070 Ti, but again, what about those various AMD versus NVIDIA differences? So watch those videos for my full thoughts. The summary of that one is the 5070 Ti and the 9070 XT have about the same performance on average, but depending on the game can actually have double-digit leads for one card or the other. And like I said, check out that video for the full details. In this video, we're looking at the 5070 against the 5070 Ti for somebody who's decided they're going the NVIDIA route, but which of these cards makes sense? Does it make sense to spend that extra $300+ to get the 5070 Ti? And we're updating it on the latest and biggest games of 2026 and some of the bigger games of the end of 2025. But first, I have thrown away so much money over the years by rejecting VPN sponsors, and that's because the first thing I check is, do they offer an independently audited no logs policy? If they don't, that's it. I'm not working with them, because one of the main reasons you want a VPN in the first place is for increased privacy. ProtonVPN checks that box, as well as everything else you're looking for in a high-quality VPN service. My main use case for VPNs is for accessing the libraries to streaming services and game services that don't exist in my country, but do exist in others. Now, a lot of you are looking for protection when doing peer-to-peer file sharing, torrenting, etc. Has great support for that, as well as a kill switch that's convenient to use. There's also great speeds with over 22 gigabit per second up to in 20,000 servers in 145 countries. It really has everything you need, and you can access all of that with a great discount by following my link in the video description and/or pinned comment, and it's less than the price of a cup of coffee per month. All right, I'm gonna hop out of the way here and be near the average results, which you can see summarized in this bottom left corner, where you can see that if you want to max out the biggest game of the year, Resident Evil Requiem, at max settings 1440p plus path tracing, but I will allow DLSS balanced with ray reconstruction. We can see that the 5070 is at 50 FPS. It's not a complete disaster, but we're also pushing right at that 12 gigabytes of VRAM barrier, I think contributing to the 5070 Ti's 34% lead, and it's averaging, 67 FPS, putting it 34% faster, and you have that extra VRAM headroom, less likely to run into any issues. So if you want to use path tracing in the latest games at 1440p, it does look like the 16 gigabytes of VRAM and additional performance pays off. And actually, interestingly, if you turn off path tracing and go to the otherwise maximum settings, 1440p max plus RT high, but try to play at native resolution, the 5070 Ti can do it at 73 FPS, whereas the 5070 is choking on VRAM, only hitting 49 FPS. The 5070 Ti is 49% faster here. So you can absolutely see that in some of the latest games at settings that are playable frame rates if you have the VRAM, the 5070 Ti's additional VRAM pays off. However, if I stay at those same 1440p max settings plus RT high, but now kick on DLSS balanced, lowering the internal rendering resolution helps with VRAM just enough to now drop the 5070 Ti's lead to only 21% at 115 FPS versus 95 on the 5070. So really, a lot of games are kind of borderline here, where if you use upscaling, you end up kind of okay. Now, another game where at the just max settings, no upscaling, we're running into issues on the 12 gigabyte card is Forza Horizon 6, 1440p Extreme plus RT, which is the max preset native resolution. We're seeing 68 FPS on the 5070 Ti, which is 31% faster than the 52 FPS on the 5070. Also, the frame time graph can get a little spikier on the 5070, and when we get out of the built-in benchmark and do a longer play session, the 12 gigabytes of VRAM starts to show even more concerns. Now, kicking on DLSS balanced does help frame rates overall. The 5070 is now hitting 81 FPS, and the 5070 Ti is 28% faster at 104 FPS. VRAM is a little less of a concern here, but like I said, in my longer play sessions on the 5070, as opposed to just a short benchmark for side-by-sides, I have noticed that this game can still, even with upscaling, sometimes have issues on the 12 gigabyte card that I'm not seeing on the 16 card. Now, if we drop down several preset notches, the game stops including ray tracing, but the otherwise maxed preset of 1440p Extreme at native resolution is showing a 30% lead for the 5070 Ti at 121 FPS versus 93 on the 5070, and it seems like here we're not seeing as much of a, pushing right against that 12 gigabyte barrier or anything like that. Frame time graph does look pretty smooth, and we could also kick on balanced level upscaling on the 1440p Extreme settings, and now we're getting 146 FPS on the 5070 Ti, which is 29% faster than the 5070, which is at its 113. Now, I still have heard some people mention that they run into some issues on the 12 gigabyte cards, even at these settings. I'm not seeing it in the built-in benchmark. Like I said, sometimes longer play sessions start to load more things into memory. Now, another big release of 2026 is Pragmata, with its maximum preset, which is called Quality, plus path tracing. With DLSS balanced and ray reconstruction enabled, the 5070 is able to average 59 FPS, whereas the 5070 Ti is hitting 76 FPS, which is 29% faster. In the more demanding scenes, the 5070 Ti stays well over 60 FPS, whereas the 5070 can drop into the mid-50s, which is still pretty playable, though. Now, if we turn off path tracing and also turn off upscaling, this is 1440p at native resolution. It's just the maximum preset is called Quality, and it does enable ray tracing by default, but like I said, I've turned off the path tracing mode. We're now seeing a 23% lead for the 5070 Ti at 124 FPS versus 101. So its lead drops a little bit here, compared to when we had path tracing enabled, but like I said, about a 23% advantage. Both are doing well, though. 1440p quality settings, but with DLSS balanced. Again, this does include ray tracing, but not the path tracing. We're seeing a 20% lead now for the 5070 Ti. It's 158 FPS versus 132. So overall, Pragmata seems to be a pretty performant game overall, especially when you're not trying to use the path tracing mode. That being said, the normal ray tracing is very noisy, and the path tracing does look significantly better, I think, than the ray tracing mode. Now, another option is just to go down to the balanced preset. This is native 1440p resolution. It's just the preset name is balanced, and this one doesn't include ray tracing by default. And in some ways, it's Well, I mean, it's definitely a less noisy image than the default ray tracing, though. So this is another route you could go if you don't want path tracing, but you also don't want the noisy ray tracing. It's 146 FPS versus 118, giving a 24% lead to the 5070 Ti. VRAM doesn't seem to be an issue at these settings. Now, just even though this video focuses on games of 2026 and late 2025, I still think that for a path tracing test, Cyberpunk is still the best example of a game where I really feel like the path tracing brings a lot to the overall game. So I thought I'd throw that in here for a path tracing test. 1440p RT overdrive, DLSS balance plus ray reconstruction. It's 60 FPS on the 5070 versus 79 on the 5070 Ti. It's a 32% advantage for that 5070 Ti. Another one of the biggest releases of 2026 is Crimson Desert. Its maximum preset is cinematic, and if you turn on ray reconstruction, it automatically turns on a additional ray tracing workload beyond the normal ray tracing on the cinematic preset. Even using DLSS balanced, the 5070 Ti is only averaging 58 FPS, but that puts it 32% faster than the 44 FPS on the 5070. So while the 5070 Ti is not quite a 60 FPS average here, it's certainly a lot more usable. Now, if we go down to the Ultra preset, which does still include some ray tracing, but not that extra ray tracing that comes with the ray reconstruction, and this is at native resolution now using TAA, the 5070 Ti is hitting 91 FPS versus 73 FPS on the 5070. So we have a 25% lead for the 5070 Ti over the 5070 here, although both are giving us a good experience on that Ultra preset. Now, what if you kick on DLSS balanced on top of that Ultra preset at 1440p? It's now 112 FPS for the 5070 Ti versus 90 FPS on the 5070, so 24% lead for the Ti version. However, in this game, I honestly don't like the look of upscalers. If you look at the grass right now, like it looks really blurry. So this is a game that I would honestly prefer to play at native resolution unless I was going for that ray reconstruction mode. Which does add a lot to the image with that more heavy-duty ray tracing look. Now, some competitive titles like Call of Duty Black Ops 7, 1440p native resolution, this is just the preset named balanced. We're seeing 215 FPS for the 5070 Ti, which is 21% faster than the 178 FPS on the 5070. So while the 5070 Ti is faster, I would hope that 178 FPS is enough for you to get the kill in the game and not blame it on performance. But, you know, you gotta blame something other than yourself, right? Now, at balanced preset 1440p with DLSS balanced, we're now seeing 233 FPS on the 5070 Ti versus 193 FPS on the 5070. So it's a 21% lead now for the Ti over the baseline product. We're certainly not seeing any VRAM issues here, although if you use the actual maximum graphic settings in this game, you can go over 12 gigabytes of VRAM, but it's a competitive title, so I don't think most people would be doing that, but I thought I'd note it here even though I didn't test it. Now, Battlefield 6 was another one of the big first-person shooter competitive games released at near the end of last year, and we're seeing at 1440p maximum preset. This is the Overkill preset. It's a 24% lead for the 5070 Ti, which is hitting 114 FPS versus the 92 FPS on the 5070. I'm using the campaign to benchmark this section of the game, but it is the same graphics engine and stuff. It's just easier to get the side-by-side footage compared to live multiplayer. Now, at 1440p Overkill settings, but with DLSS balanced, we're now hitting 156 FPS on the 5070 Ti, which is 21% faster than the 5070, which is hitting 129 FPS. So both are able to give you a pretty good experience if you just max out the graphic settings and then kick on DLSS balanced. I'd be perfectly happy playing the multiplayer at these frame rates, but some people will be chasing even higher frame rates, which you can do by turning things down. If we go down to the medium preset, but back to native resolution, we're now hitting 175 FPS on the 5070 Ti and 145 FPS on the 5070. That's 21% lead for the 5070 Ti, and we're not seeing any signs of VRAM being a concern here. And again, this is still at native resolution, 1440p, just using the medium preset. But if you're chasing even higher frame rates, you can, of course, kick on DLSS balanced on top of the medium graphics preset at 1440p, and we're now hitting 219 FPS on the 5070 Ti, which puts it 18% faster than the 5070, which is hitting 185 FPS. However, while I'm seeing the 5070 Ti's lead drop here a bit, when you start hitting really high frame rates, even on a high-end CPU like my 9800 X3D that we're using in this system, you can sometimes start to get into some system limitations, stopping GPUs from showing their full performance advantage. Another popular multiplayer title that released either last year or the end of the year before is Marvel Rivals. Still has a lot of player counts on Steam, etc. So testing it here with the built-in benchmark, 1440p Ultra, we're seeing 87 FPS on the 5070 Ti versus 71 FPS on the 5070, so 23% lead for the 5070 Ti at these settings. Note that I'm not using the full benchmark run, I'm using this initial section of the benchmark run if you're comparing at home. DLSS balanced on the Ultra settings with a 1440p output. We're seeing 124 FPS on the 5070 Ti, which is putting it 16% faster than the 5070, which is hitting 107 FPS. So again, the lead starting to shrink there a little bit. Could just be what's happening. Sometimes you do get into system limitations, factoring into the performance uplift a little bit the higher the settings go. Frame rates go. But anyway, if we drop to medium settings, which I think for a multiplayer title might make a lot of sense here, but native resolution 1440p, we're now hitting 143 FPS on the 5070 Ti, which is putting it 21% faster than the 5070, which is hitting 118 FPS. Again, no signs that we're running into VRAM related issues here or anything like that, and it's a 21% lead for the 5070 Ti, so noticeable, but both getting good frame rates. Now, Subnautica 2 technically released in early access rather than a full release this year, but did hit huge player counts when it launched, and at 1440p medium settings, we're seeing 101 FPS on the 5070 Ti versus 81 on the 5070, 25% advantage for the 5070 Ti at these settings, and the game does still look quite good at the medium settings. The Epic settings when this launched were, let's just say, not particularly optimized. So I focused on the more usable settings there. Now, the game of the year of last year, even if it didn't necessarily sell the most copies, was Clair Obscur Expedition 33, Unreal Engine 5 title, so at Epic settings, 1440p native resolution, it is very demanding. We're hitting 59 FPS on the 5070 Ti here, which puts it 23% faster than the 5070's 48 FPS. But maybe running at native resolution max settings in Unreal Engine 5 games isn't always the best choice, so if you just kick on DLSS Balanced, which still looks quite good here, but keep the Epic preset at 1440p output, we're now hitting 90 FPS on the 5070 Ti. And 78 FPS on the baseline 5070. That's only a 15% advantage for the 5070 Ti, so, potentially we could be seeing some kind of limitation with all these NPCs here and things like that that might not be entirely GPU limited at all points, just a thought. And now, if we drop down to medium settings, but back to native resolution 1440p, we're now seeing 99 FPS on the 5070 Ti versus 82 FPS on the 5070. So the Ti version has a 21% advantage, and there's, again, no signs of VRAM being a concern at Epic settings, and especially not at medium settings on the 12GB card. Now, we could also use balance level upscaling on the medium settings at 1440p, and the 5070 Ti's lead drops to 14%. It's hitting 136 FPS versus 119 FPS on the 5070. And again, I would be somewhat suspicious that with this many NPCs and things and dropping to medium settings with upscaling, that there's some other system limitations, maybe not showing the GPU's full potential advantage here when we see that 14% lead. Now, that is all of the tests that I ran for this updated comparison in the latest games of 2026, as well as some of the biggest releases of 2025, especially ones that weren't out at the time of my previous testing. So how do we summarize the results? So here's a chart showing us the average FPS in all of these tests. Notice that we focus on 1440p in this video, as I think that's the most likely target, but I used both native resolution and upscaling, as well as maximum settings, but also reduced settings, so that we could see that, okay, maybe at max settings, native resolution, 12 gigabytes can give an issue sometimes, but if we reduce the settings and or use upscaling, does that solve the problem for the 12 gigabyte card? Now, this is a lot to look at. So in general, I think what I would make of it is, if this is the 50 FPS line, which I would deem as pretty usable, although I'd probably adjust settings to try to get better performance, we can see that even the 5070 is generally above that line, and the 5070 Ti gets a little advantage above that, making it more likely to be closer to 60 FPS or so, even at those heaviest of settings that we tested. However, if we're just looking at the percentage advantage, it's easier to look at. So looking at this, you can see that in all of these testings, if we do a geo mean of all the FPS results, and take a look at that, the 5070 Ti averages 24% faster, although you can see game by game and settings by settings, sometimes it's closer to a 20% lead, sometimes it's closer to a 30% lead, and sometimes we see a much bigger lead, like 49% here, and that's not coming down to a performance advantage for the GPU, it's more that it had enough VRAM on the 5070 Ti, whereas the 5070 didn't for those particular settings. Now, if we compare that to my older video, which tested more resolutions and a different set of games, that one also averaged out to 24% faster, with some big outliers where VRAM became a big concern. So overall, I would say that the performance results in the latest games that I tested in this video are pretty consistent with the performance results that I saw in my older video. It's still averaging out, if you want to summarize it that way, to 24% faster on average for the 5070 Ti, but it enables you to use some settings that the 5070 couldn't, so you kind of relieve some headaches. So that brings us then back to some of that math, where if the lowest price model of each is compared, you're spending 53% more money for 24% more performance. It's certainly less performance per dollar on the 5070 Ti, but also less headaches, and you do get a noticeable performance boost. There were absolutely games where you can just set the maximum settings on the 5070 Ti and at most have to adjust upscaling and not really have to worry about playing around with the settings, where on the baseline 5070, you do have to be a little more conscious of the settings that you're using, so there is some of that peace of mind there. So is it worth the extra $320? Is it worth spending $920 as opposed to $600, a 53% increase? Well, I would say, it could be worth it to some people. I also should again remind you that you can look at the AMD options, but I've explored those more in other videos. If you have just concluded that you will buy NVIDIA and you're not going to consider those AMD options, you're just asking yourself, which NVIDIA GPU is right for you? You could spend the $900, but you'd maybe rather spend $600. Is it really worth it? I would really say, look at other parts of your PC first, maybe. For example, if to fit in that $920 5070 Ti, you would be having to really cut corners on the CPU, or maybe you're having to fit in only 16 gigabytes of system RAM instead of 32, given the price of RAM these days. I would say that you should consider those other aspects of your PC a little bit first, especially those that affect performance. However, if you have already got those in pretty good shape and you still could fit in that extra $300 or so, I do think you'll have a lot more longevity on the system and just peace of mind on the 5070 Ti, but the baseline 5070 absolutely is offering you better value. And I think most people could be completely fine on a 5070 and not really have a lot of concerns or anything like that. And I think it will do a good job for a long time to come. It's just, the peace of mind and additional performance on the 5070 Ti is certainly nice to have. So I'm gonna say that it's not, I'm not going to say don't buy a 5070 Ti, just be aware of the diminishing returns and what you're paying for. Now, especially if you're somebody who plays single-player AAA games and likes to turn on things like path tracing, that's really where I think the 5070 Ti starts to offer you something that not only the 5070 struggles more at, but even the AMD alternatives start to struggle with a bit, because sometimes the path tracing modes are unsupported, or when they are supported, don't run particularly well. So if you're that kind of player, that's where the 5070 Ti starts to, I think, make even more sense. Whereas if you're the kind of person who's mostly playing, competitive titles and things like that, where honestly the VRAM's usually not a concern, and you're probably turning down settings anyway, and the 5070 is getting high frame rates anyway, that's where I'd probably steer you towards just get the 5070 and throw more money at the CPU. So if you're more competitive multiplayer focused, 5070 is probably enough, and definitely focus on maxing out that CPU side of things. If you're AAA single player, like to crank the maximum graphics settings in the latest releases, that's where the diminishing returns on the 5070 Ti might still be worth it to you, as it makes some experiences a little more accessible. So anyway, that's what I've got for you guys today in the updated video. And hopefully you guys found it useful and or interesting for making your decisions. And once again, a reminder that you could be checking out the AMD competitions in my dedicated head-to-heads on those. And don't forget to check out ProtonVPN in the link in the video description and or pinned comment for that awesome deal. I hope you all have an excellent day.